Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first meeting of this year's Transmedia Arts Seminar, co-sponsored by Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard and MetaLab at Harvard. Today, first I want to introduce my colleague, Ramona Moss, who will be co-chairing the seminar with me this year. We are thrilled to have Ramona on board. I also want to introduce Jingyi Zhang, who is a graduate student at Harvard in musicology. And Jingyi will be leading the conversation today. We are excited. We're going to be talking about contemporary experimental opera and technology and AI and digital experiments with operatic music. So thank you everyone for joining in today. And after the conversation, we will have a Q&A and everybody will be able to ask participants questions either through chat or through Q&A feature. This seminar is recorded, just to remind everyone, and will be posted and available on MetaLab and Mahindra website shortly. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, all of the participants. Jingyi, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Jingyi and really happy for, everyone to join us today for this special event. So I'm the moderator for this really awesome panel today, and we are truly honored to have such a wonderful group of scholars, practitioners joining us for our panel on the future of opera. So I'll first begin by introducing the panelists in alphabetical order, starting with Jelena Novak. So I'm personally very fond of Jelena's work as a contemporary opera scholar. She's written a lot of books on this. So her fields of interest are modern and contemporary music, recent opera, singing, new media, capitalist realism, voice studies, and feminine identities in music. Exploring those fields, she works as a researcher, lecturer, writer, dramaturge, music critic, editor, and curator focused on bringing together critical theory and contemporary art. Her most recent books are Operaphilia from 2018 and Einstein on the Beach, co-edited with John Richardson, published in 2019. Alan Pearlman is a New York-based new media artist, curator, critic, and educator. She's also the founder and director of ThoughtWorks Arts, a global technology research lab. She created Noir, a brainwave opera, and AIBO, I hope I pronounced it correctly, which stands for an emotionally intelligent artificial intelligence brainwave opera. Currently, she's working on Language is Leaving Me, an opera of the skin, which explores AI, computer vision, and the impacts of trauma in cultures of diaspora through epigenetics. Next, we have Kamala Sankaram, who is praised as one of the most exciting opera composers in the country. She moves freely between the worlds of experimental music and contemporary opera. Recent submissions include awards for the Glimmerglass Festival, Washington National Opera, and Creative Time, among others. Kamala is known for her operas based in Indian classical music and for work that pushes the boundaries of the operatic form. And last but not least, we have Brian Staufenbiel, who directed and spearheaded the conceptual designs of the Indie Opera Company, Opera Parallels production since it was founded in 2010. Specializing in multimedia, immersive, and interdisciplinary productions, he actively works across a wide range of artistic disciplines, collaborating in film and with media designers, choreographers and dancers, circus and fabric artists, and designer facilitators. So once again, we are really fortunate to gather this amazing group of multidisciplinary artists and scholars here with us today. So as a small note on our roundtable session today, so as moderator, I will be posing questions to the whole group, and then anyone from any panelist can jump in at any time to respond to them or to each other. There are also speaker-specific questions later on. And lastly, we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So let's begin. So it's been over 2 years and we are still stuck in this global pandemic. So perhaps I think it's a good idea to begin this session with a question on opera making today. So my first question for this panel is, the COVID-19 pandemic offered this opportunity for the performing arts to spearhead innovative transmedia storytelling formats that move fluidly across media boundaries, artistic genres, and geographical borders. So how did it affect your own work? And how did it impact other artists whom you know? So anyone can start the ball rolling.
Maybe I'll jump in, because I think that I did one of the first of these experiments with sort of telematic opera using Zoom, which for better or for worse is a thing now, because I and many of my colleagues, our work was canceled for the foreseeable future, and I was concerned that it was actually going to last longer than 6 weeks, as was being said at the time. So I brought together a few different singer friends and asked if they would be willing to jump in and try to do something over Zoom. And what that led to was sort of finding a way to create a piece that was not working from a shared sense of pulse, but was rather more aleatoric in nature. So there's an open sort of chance element to it. And it really, that gave the singers the kind of agency that they don't always get in opera. And I can show a short clip of that if you'd like.
Sure.
So this piece was called All Decisions Will Be Made by Consensus. And as you'll see, it's about a Zoom meeting and it takes place in Zoom.
So what
I think we sorry, you go. I think we
sorry, I was muted. Sorry.
You go.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm taking minutes, just so everybody knows.
The one thing we need to decide today is a date for the action.
Now is our moment. Right
there was
now.
A question about the weather.
People are behind
there
us.
Was a question about the seasons.
I think we.
The weather for the
Oh,
action.
sorry.
Now is our moment.
You go.
Right
The
now.
weather for the action.
Not
People are
everyone
behind
has
us.
the same bandwidth. This is not the way to go. I was levitating the Pentagon before you were born.
So what's interesting about working on this piece was that it kind of returned this agency to the singers in a way that we have moved away from in the field of opera in general. And so what I would like to see going forward is that, more opera companies now are experimenting with digital platforms and with emerging technologies, but also putting the singer in the center in a way that we haven't always. And I think that's something else that's really important that's come out of the performance practices that have emerged in this time period, is just that the singer, the performer, not only as an interpreter, but also as a co-collaborator, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. That's amazing. I also, does anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I want to say something. I didn't have a clip prepared of this, but I made something called, didn't have singing because it wasn't opera, but it's very relevant to performative, called Dancedemic in a Pandemic, in which one dancer alone was in a studio and turned on a camera, and a biometric device was strapped to their body. And as they danced, they had collaborators creating the set design lifetime all around the world. And they had musicians collaborating lifetime with the soundtrack as their biometrics changed the visuals and the sound as they were dancing. And this all happened on the network lifetime. So we had collaborators from San Francisco, Toronto, Florida, London, Estonia, Ukraine, Brazil, and India, all lifetime, manipulating the set and the sounds. And this was a group effort, and it took place with one performer in a studio. So the sounds, it wasn't exactly opera, but it was performative practices. So we couldn't, so unlike Kamala, whose work I admire very much and is really fantastic, this was just using the network itself as the point of conductivity and the human biometrics to drive aspects of that, instead of the voice as the driver. It was the human biometrics as driver, but the voice could be the driver.
But could I also, I think what's wonderful about your work, Ellen, and what you're talking about is how people from all over the world are coming together to collaborate. And I think that's another thing that changed in the pandemic, is more openness to these sort of cross-geographical collaborations that we, for some reason, were hesitant to try, even though Zoom has existed as a platform since before the pandemic. But I think that's beautiful.
Yes. I just found it also really beautiful that even though, the pandemic shut down a lot of live performing, but it kind of created this new way of performing, like bringing together people in a very different way across time zones, across various kinds of cultural borders, geographical borders. So that's something that is truly empowering for creative artists. Yeah.
Well, to Kamala's piece, which is really cool, is you've got this issue of latency, right? So so you have to be savvy like she was. So you've got a kind of beautiful tonality, but then there's an aleatory quality of the singers being able to come in and bump into each other, but it doesn't ruin this kind of written out, chordal rhythmic structure that you might be able to pull off in a live performance. So that's something a lot of people are having problems with. That's a great solve. At least what we showed us was great. I was going to say that it allowed me, because we had the company I work for, Upper Parallel, we were going to do Harvey Milk, we were bringing it back for its anniversary, and then everything shut down. So it allowed me to explore something I've been fascinated with and started earlier on, the sort of the synergy of graphic novel operas and opera, and sort of that, and they share a lot in common in many ways, especially in the use of language. And I can share a little clip of what we did. We made a graphic novel opera film that we were able to share with people. You see that? Is that full screen? Sorry if it's not. No? Sorry.
We can see that.
You can?
Oh. Yeah, we can see that.
Great. I'm going to share that. Can you see that?
Everest summit. It's 2:30. I'm here. It's wrong. I made it.
And so one of the things that was really fun is it allowed us, and just really quickly, is that we were able to work with each person individually, put them, do motion capture, illustrate them. And so we were able to do it safely in times of COVID. Like we put them in this big bubble and film their face, film them in a film studio, and then sort of with all the pieces put together a film. That was the only reason we could pull it off. And that's why we were able to do that. And it was a great adventure.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to watch this over the pandemic. And I thought it was really a very fascinating way of opera making. And also it changes a lot of, I don't know, like I'm also wondering for creative artists, when you are using this sort of new visual idiom in coming up with this new piece, does it impact the way you're composing in terms of the sound and as well as the whole conception of the piece? Maybe Kamala, do you want to speak more to that?
Yeah, because I think one of the things that had to happen was an embrace of amplification. Finally, I feel there's always been this sort of a debate in opera as to whether to mic or not, and I think it's a tool. And so what had to happen is because we were moving through this virtual medium, everyone had to be mic'd, and so now I think I hope there's less fear of it. But because one of the things that miking does is it allows you to have this more declamatory kind of singing style. Like if you're having to sing at the Met and you have to reach the back of a 3,000 seat house, then you can't get the speech rhythms the same way that you can if it's close miking. And so that's been really interesting to see how it's impacted the way that I, for one, am thinking about writing for, and I've always thought about amplification as part of the composition rather than as something that is put in later on. But it's interesting to see how that's also being put into these projects like Everest, right, which is intended to be a big piece, without microphones. And then, but still learning how to mic that in order to record it properly and all of that. And I think it's something that we really needed to do. So I'm glad that it happened.
To your point, I can think of 4 different grand opera productions, a couple at the Met where they mic'd. It's just like, I don't know if that's a direct correlation to what you were saying, but pretty amazing.
Yeah. I think there's an openness to it now that we don't have to hide the mics anymore because it's fine.
Yeah, and I want to jump in on something Brian brought up that Kamala said, which is the issue of latency. And when you talk about the mic and what's happening that has happened is a mediated space of signal processing. And I run into that a lot when I work with biometrics, because you have to do a lot of signal processing in order to translate it into another form. And signal processing, even if it's through a mic and certainly on the Zoom, has an inherent latency that you can't overcome because of the hardware and software and networks. And so the performative aspects must incorporate that latency very strongly. In other words, the audience, that I found the audience doesn't buy it. So the actual construction and composition has to understand the latency, which in the type of things I do runs anywhere from 2 seconds to 11 seconds because of the type of signal processing I do. And so that is the responsibility of the composer and the performers. The performers have to retrain for latency aspects. And as you said, Kamala, with mics and signal processing. And that was really great with the cartoons. I would watch that in a minute. This is really wonderful.
So I'm curious, can each of you talk to me about what new, like you have exposed to all new technologies during this COVID time. So which media are you most drawn to and why? And what is the most challenging to work with? And then the follow-up question, another follow-up question is, which ones do you think are here to stay? So this is really speculative, so yeah.
I can take that. The thing I'm going to say is, number one, all of them are here to stay. Number two is I have gone in working, unlike these other distinguished panelists who are deeply trained in opera, I am deeply trained in tech. So it's a little different aspect. And I've gone from working with brainwaves to working with brainwaves and artificial, and now into artificial intelligence. And now I will be working with artificial intelligence, speech, and computer vision. And all of these technologies are emerging, will have no way back, and were accelerated and are being accelerated through the pandemic. Brian mentions motion capture, which is another technology which is, I would say, undervalued and just as important. And where motion capture is being privileged at this moment is unfortunately in the metaverse. You'll see a lot more of that in the metaverse. And I have conflicted feelings about performance in purely virtual spaces. I think hybrid is much more effective than purely virtual. So that's the quick view from a more technological point of view, as opposed to a strictly operatic traditional development point of view.
But if I would jump in and just say that I think that that's the view from the opera point of view also, in that, you know, like I think that I have a couple of projects that I've done in virtual reality, and I think that what's always missing from them is the social aspect of going to the theater. You know, that's part of why we go, is to see other people and to see how they're reacting and to feel like we've had this shared experience. So I think that's why a lot of these projects are now going towards something that is more hybrid, like augmented reality or mixed reality, rather than pure virtual reality, or even pure digital video. You know, at the end of the day, it's nice to be able to be there with other people.
Yeah, maybe here to mention the piece by Michel van der Aa. It's called 8. It was not made during the pandemics, but it was made just prior to it in 2019, I think. But in a way, it announced what awaited us later in pandemics. Because that was a piece that could be seen only by one person at the time. And everyone has to reserve the slot of 15 minutes. But when I did that, actually, I was not aware that there is more into it. When I appeared in Muziekgebouw in Amsterdam, where the performance took place, actually the whole building was completely emptied. No one was there except one lady at the entrance, and she said, just follow the arrows and climb to the small hall at the top of the building. At that moment, I thought that it's a public holiday or something. Because of that, the building is empty. But all that was part of the direction of the piece, actually. So you climb the stairs, you arrive to the small hall, and actually there you meet a predecessor, so to say, the person who is waiting before you to enter. And then you enter the interactive virtual reality installation to be the only person at that moment in the universe to see that opera. And it was for me the first time to be in opera in that way, to be in virtual reality. And the most strange experience that I realized only afterwards was that this artist made me a central character of the piece, which I never ever expected, actually. So that provoked just all kinds of questions, like what it means to be in opera alone today, and how you become part of the opera actually as a performer in a way. So that was the interesting experience even before the pandemics.
And I think that's something that we always have to take into consideration, right, when dealing with emerging technologies, is why and what is the audience relationship to the technology. And my piece, the Parksville Murders, which is a VR piece that I made in 2016, I think. The way that we dealt with that was the audience is the killer. It's not to give it away, but it's a horror piece. And so at the end, you as the viewer inside of it, you're the one who's actually killing people. But I think that's the tricky thing about VR, though, because you're in this such an immersive, you're cast inside of it. Then we have to ask, why are you there? Whereas I think with augmented reality, one of the things that's a little easier about it is that you're not in this. You have your own perspective rather than this perspective that's been being given by the virtual world. But I'm curious to hear what other people think about this.
I definitely think that I'm excited to use technology and see what people are doing to bring the audience more into the piece a little bit, what you were just both talking about. Yet, it can be dangerous and it can isolate people too, right? If you put a headset on and you're by yourself at home and you're experiencing opera, that's the counter of having a room full of people experiencing it and riffing off of each other and feeling that energy. So I've been very interested in seeing, and I'm both seeing it and experimenting in actual true immersive environments where the audience is inside the piece. And we're actually going to take the assets of Everest next season, and we're going to do a fully immersive 360 projected on the people with white ponchos, characters moving around. So you're like in base camp on Everest, the audience. And that's where the technology is affordable. I mean, you guys remember when projectors were, to rent one projector 10 years ago was your whole budget. And now you can rent, for the same price, you can rent 10. Mm-hmm. So it's that kind of affordability is also helping us.
Mm-hmm. So all of you mentioned, the importance of the audience experience and how it kind of places you at a very different kind of, way to interact with the piece. So, so my next question for the panel is, how does transmedia opera transform audience experience in different ways? Because in many of your bio works, the word immersive keeps coming up, and a lot of, when they try to advertise certain operas, they always say it's an immersive production, and a site-specific opera is immersive production, a digital opera is an immersive production. So I'm wondering if you can share with us what immersiveness means to you, and why is there so much hype over the word immersive, and what are some elements that contribute to immersive experience in audiences?
I think first and foremost, immersive for me means that I'm inside of the piece, because normally in more classical pieces of opera or just music, you just go there and you're kind of spectator from the outside in a way. But when that position is designed in a way that you are even sometimes at the center of the piece, then you are immersed. But it does not have to be always with all these screens and all these experimenting with VR. For me, I think the most interesting things are when it happens only with the sound. Mm-hmm. And for example, with production of Stockhausen's Licht in Amsterdam in 2019, I think also before the pandemics, Pierre Audi staged almost the whole cycle. But with truly magnificent surrounding sound in the ex-Gasfabrik in Amsterdam. And I think that was one of the most immersive experiences that I felt in opera. Although the role of the screens and projections, visual projections was not big at all in that production, but the role of the sound and the sound projection was really something interesting in that piece.
I just jump in that I've had many conversations with people about what is, just like what you asked, right? Because some people really feel immersive. The audience has to have some sort of agency for it to truly be immersive in the theater sense, where you're going and you're guiding yourself through an experience. And then there's just the physical, like the sound immersiveness you're just talking about, right? And so I think immersive now, people are sort of applying it to their immersive work because it's a great word, right? It really encompasses a lot of possibilities, right? So I'd be curious what others have to say about their immersive work.
I think in a way it's not, when you go to see the piece or to hear the piece, these pieces that are immersive, they are starting to see you in a way. So, like they grab you and they change the role. I'm remembering, for example, the installation Opera for a Small Room by Janet Cardiff and George Barris Miller. There is a cottage in a gallery normally, and then you, as a kind of voyeur, you observe what happens there, and there is the whole narrative that happens connected with all the LPs of the operas, etc. Mm-hmm. So you are not immersed in a technological way in that piece. But by that narrative and looking through the crack of the cottage, in a way, you are really grabbed and installed in a way inside that very cottage. So that piece is also immersive in a way.
Yeah,
I think to add to that, I think that that's one of the things that's exciting about doing music, music theater, opera as an immersive piece, which is letting people get closer to the sound. Very few people have been next to an opera singer when they're singing, and it's something that's pretty amazing, you know, to the physicality of it and the volume of it and the vibration in the body and all of these other things that you can't get when you're sitting far away from a proscenium stage. So that to me is also very interesting, is actual the physical experience of the sound.
Yeah, and I want to take off that with sort of what Kamala said and what everyone has said, in that when I work on a piece, I actually have in the past pieces worked with scientists in human-computer interaction. And the reason for that is I'm not trying to make a science piece, but I'm really working with setting up feedback loops. And feedback loops loop into agency, and they also loop into what was said about motion capture. And the VR experiences that work the best, besides mixed reality, are those in which the physical body of the person in motion in the VR experience is actually moving. And that's a whole new jump that's happened over the pandemic, as there are new motion capture suits for group interactivity. The type of human-computer interaction biofeedback loops that I work with have a lot to do with gaze, touch, motion, and of course, biometric interactivity. In other words, what is immersive? And the immersive is the human senses being absorbed and changed and reacting and interacting to the environment and other sensory experience that creates a sort of unique feedback loop. And that's what I define as immersive. There's some type of feedback loop between the digitization, the experience, and the audience and the performer.
Yeah, I really like this idea of this kind of natural feedback loop that engages fully with our five senses, not just the visual domain. And I think what Jelena said just now about the medium of sound itself to create immersion is super insightful, because if you think about it, you know, when it comes to sight, we can always close our eyes whenever we want to, right? So we can choose what to look, what to not look. But our ears, we can't shut our ears. So we are constantly exposed to whatever sounds there are. So in a way, that kind of makes sound or music a more easier medium to get at this immersive state. And also same goes with, you know, the sense of touch, right? You can't exactly be not like cut yourself away from your environment. So this idea of this feedback loop comes into play here. So that's really, really fascinating. So now I'm trying to play the devil's advocate here. So given all this hype, you know, publicity surrounding these newer technologies, could it be possible that we are getting so caught up with all this novelty that we've lost sight of artistic feasibility or this sort of like compatibility? Yeah, so who wants to take that on? Or maybe another way to ask this is, does it work all the time? Have you seen cases where it doesn't work as successfully as you thought it would in a performance event?
I think it depends on your definition of success. You know, some things are not meant to be linear, narrative. Some things are meant to be abstract and poetic. Some things are purely experimental just to see what happens. And I think there's room for all of them. I think this is the other thing that I hope that opera has learned from the pandemic is there are many kinds of opera. There are many ways to approach making it, and there is an audience for all of them, right? So we should allow the ecosystem to be larger than it has been.
I would maybe like to remember Philip Glass here. I interviewed him in 2007 in Lisbon, I think. And then we were talking about new media in opera, etc. And then Philip said, when you will have like 3D projection in a room, then you'll have something. by then, like it's not really that. In a way, I can share this view, because what pandemic also brought to me is this bitter taste of two-dimensionality. We were all on the screens all the time, and that was just too much, and it provoked all kinds of fatigues and Zoom fatigue at some point. And I was watching after all these blockades of theaters and operas, everything was shut down and wiped down by pandemics. I still have this bitter feeling of how everything was just silent. For me, actually, it was not, I still don't see it as something that really induced creativity. I more see it as an event that tried to repress the art still. So in a way, the piece that I liked the most during the pandemics, that in a way problematized all these two-dimensionalities of Zoom and all these little screens that we were involved with, was actually Laurie Anderson's Spending the War Without You. This lecture performance, combination of documentary, of her own life, of all kinds of thoughts about life and art and media also. That was something that for me was an interesting moment in the pandemics also, to make the footnote. Because in a way it tried to go out of this two-dimensionality of the screen that we were all linked to at the moment.
Well, I want to say something about human capability that I've learned from working with performers in these experiences. And that's the question of thresholding. And thresholding in human cognition is a very underrated thing, because what I've learned, and I'm sure you see this when you train performers and endurance, is that human cognition can only take certain kind of mediated experiences for a certain amount of time, and then it thresholds or stops.
Right.
And so when the question is, have you seen unsuccessful examples of this? The unsuccessful examples I have seen is where the creator of the event doesn't take into consideration the thresholds of the audience and tends to oversaturate, overwhelm, and overdo it. And in that place, the audience, like being on a Zoom for like 5 hours is one example of that. It's you just can't take it. And that, I think, when you say what are the unsuccessful examples, for me, that was the thing I noticed the most, is that these flat two-dimensional experiences do not understand, for the most part, the thresholding of the person who is cognizing or viewing them. And that for me was a big learning curve to understand that with these types of mediated experiences.
But I would say that's true for real ones too. No.
I was going to sort of take it away from the Zoom, flat panel experience to when do you see something that doesn't work in the context of the theater or site specific? And for me, it's usually it comes across as though the designers who are using all these different technologies, director, composer, librettist are not communicating.
Right.
And so it's like this collision of ideas as opposed to a larger conversation about the concept. What are we doing together and how are these things interfacing? And when you do that, it can blow people's minds, because then nothing is sticking out. You forget there's video actually because you're in it, or you forget there's these other kind of technologies you're using. So that's when I've seen it fail. It's just, you can tell it's a lack of communication.
Mm-hmm. And also probably because it's the first time opera companies or indie opera companies are experimenting with these really new technologies that haven't been experimented before. So they're still trying, so the technologies are kind of doing their thing, the composers are doing their thing. So maybe it's less about the lack of communication, but they haven't had the experience to work together before. So I guess hopefully, in the near future, there will be much more productive exchange and more learning from each other in this opera making process. I think that would be very
experience.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just everybody learning from each other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I would say also learning the new performance practices, because what works on a proscenium is not necessarily what's going to work in an immersive situation or in a situation with new technologies. And it's really hard for people to leave behind the techniques that they have spent so long getting good at to try something new. But that's what has to happen.
There is also one thing that is very special and very important for every opera, I think, whether conventional opera or contemporary progressive experimental piece. And I almost take it as a kind of diagnose of the piece sometimes. And that is the core of the opera, is the relationship between the singing voice and the body that sings in all kinds of modalities. So I think it's very important when you watch the new piece to sometimes, in a way, recognize that question and ask yourself, like, what happens with this core of the opera there? If it's constantly multiplied in a same kind of way, like conventional opera does, then I think those pieces have a tendency not to be very progressive, or they just multiply the concepts that we saw already for many times before. And sometimes even a close excursion in a piece that reinvents that relationship between the body and the voice, whether that is by the new media or by some playing with the gender roles or some desynchronization between the body and the voice, then normally something progressive happens.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really fascinating, just looking at the relationship between voice and the body, and cases where they disembodied, right? Seeing happens and the possibilities, the potentials for all that. So the next question is, I'm just really fascinated by all of you and all of the work that you're doing, especially all of you on this panel wears many hats, right? For instance, Jelena, you are an opera scholar, but also dramaturg, music critic, curator. Brian, you direct both operas and films and then collaborates closely with Philip Glass. Kamala, you're a composer that straddles, boundary of experimental music, contemporary opera, and also vast in new technologies. Alan, you're a new media artist, curator, critic, educator, who's also very interested in the possibilities brought about by AI. So my question for all of you is, how does each of you navigate this, multifaceted roles that you play? Does each artistic role inform your approach or thinking in other roles? How so, and in what ways? So anyone can start.
I think it's like when you cook in the kitchen, like you can try the new recipe, then you're a researcher. you can try to perform a recipe that is already then you're a kind of performer. You can go to shop for a nice ingredients. You can do all these roles. You can serve the dish or find a new way how to serve it. So I see it more like that, and it's all cooking in a way. It's all the world of opera. So especially with contemporary opera, which does not have very strong institutions, right, in terms of an opera building, of the system of stars and the whole protocol of like conventional opera does. I think it's even necessary to do it in that kind of way, because otherwise you'll miss some dimension of that world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I guess I could also speak to the context of the United States in particular, you know, where there isn't a lot of funding for the arts. And so often if you want to make something experimental or that doesn't fit neatly into the boundaries of some established genre or funding structure, you have to do everything yourself because the infrastructure isn't there. Mm. And so, you know, that's something that you see a lot from people who are interested in you know, what is going to be something that pushes against the form, is that they have to invent things, and they have to invent new structures in order to make them happen. And then over time, maybe those structures become established, like with the people from Bang on a Can, for example, mm-hmm. that when they started out, they were these sort of rebellious and downtown composers, and now they're very established, and they have their own music festival that they do every year. Or even someone like Laurie Anderson, you know, who is this amazing, innovative, creative person, and just had a solo show at the Hirshhorn in DC, which was fabulous, but a major solo retrospective at a giant institution. So I think there's this interesting thing about straddling both, because that's the way that it works. That's the path.
Mm-hmm.
And to riff off of that, you know, it's like you find a lot of these young companies, which I admire so much, who have no money whatsoever, and they're reaching out to their community. Mm-hmm. And we're going to do an opera, and we're going to talk to these people over here who have a puppet company, and we're going to collaborate, and we're going to, you know, tell the story through the physicality of puppets while the singers dance behind them. The list is endless of what has been done, but it sort of speaks to what we're talking about here, and, you know, of just what means you have. If people want to create, they will find a way. And now we're doing it through technology, but it's just like throwing a wider net, you know, to make it happen.
Yeah, and something that's very relevant is community. And, you know, all of you are so deeply soaked and such experts in opera, and your base community is the operatic, even if it's the operatic indie or operatic indie music community. And what's interesting about the pieces I make is the prime audience for these is actually the audience, and then human computer interaction, engineers, artificial intelligence people, computer scientists. I mean, that's part of the people who I'm speaking to when I make these pieces, because my work always employs technologies that are breaking. And when they're breaking right at the very beginning, and like Kamala, you said you did VR in 2016, and that's when I made my first brainwave opera. You know, there is almost no precedence. So the forms are messy, and the audience it's very hard for a traditional opera audience in terms of the community to embrace this. They tend to denounce it because the tradition is so wonderful and so grand and so deep and so has a lot of longevity. And, they're right. But these new forms break ground in a way which is very disruptive and breaks the definitions. And so when you talk about how do you jump between these roles, it's like, who do you send this to? Who do you have in dialogue? And I think that's also part of it. Like, this is what we're doing right now, is both to the opera community and also to other communities who would be interested, who might be new media, or might be more technical, or might be, more physically oriented. I don't know. So that's part of it, is what communities are you speaking to besides the ticket paying audience?
Mm-hmm.
Ellen, do you want me to play your Nor right now? Because it sort of makes sense to play that. Is that okay with everybody?
And that's the first one before I started using AI, but you'll see the performer wearing the brainwave headset, triggering every sound you hear and every visual you hear, except for our talking to each other, is triggered by her brainwaves.
Cool. Here we go.
Nur Inayat Khan was the daughter of Hazrat Inayat Khan, who brought Sufism to the West. He died when Nur was 13.
A man with a strong message.
My irresistible. My father.
The family moved to France. World War II broke out.
Aerial bombardment.
The world I knew changed all of a sudden with war. We were looking for a new home.
But Nur was not content doing nothing, and she joined British Secret Intelligence. Training as a wireless operator.
So, the images were key to emotional states, yet were randomly generated. And there were 4 emotions that came off her brainwaves, which were interest, excitement, frustration, and meditation. And so the sounds were composed by a sonic composer. And if you see, she's touching the audience, she's looking at them, she's moving through them. And that it took 5 months to train her to do that. Without triggering the same, without over triggering her brainwaves. And those brainwaves can't be faked. Like in acting, you can fake it. You can't fake your brainwaves. So, no, you just can't. You believe me, we tried. You can't. So that's what I mean by a feedback loop happening. And there was no proscenium stage. Yet there was no invasiveness of the audience. It was very gentle and very soft and very inviting. And no one felt threatened or invaded by their personal space or agency. So I just wanted to emphasize that as well.
Yeah, I'm really amazed by how creative artists who work outside of the mainstream, opera institutions, how they are the ones who are spearheading, a lot of changes and excitement in the opera field today, precisely because I think they are really vested on, the underground collaborations with different kinds of artists. So a lot is happening, right? And in recent years, there's also this, you can see this transformation traditional opera companies where they are kind of learning from indie opera companies like green screen technology, you know, like what Yuval Sharon was doing. I just went to watch his the Walküres at Detroit last week, right? This idea of having these two layers of performance. One is the physical actors there performing and singing, and then in real time being translated onto this digital projection with this virtual set. So, and that is something that was happening in the opera companies, and then he just took it up and then trying to, you know, make it more mainstream in traditional companies. So there is this. So I like this kind of dynamic, creative exchange between in the operatic ecology of today. I thought it was really really fascinating.
You know what was interesting about that piece, if I may, because I was researching a little bit. I've done a ton of green screening for projects where you take the actor and you have them sing an aria, and then they can be singing an aria with themselves because you've done it before, right? And that's wonderful. What was interesting about that is kind of the transmogrification that he pulled off with a full green screen live, which is very Brechtian. We're seeing how it's created. Right. Then you have people with motion capture suits on Ellen on stage. So and people in costumes, right? So all three of those kind of technologies are blended in the moment, right? And then you have it's sort of the kind of fully blended version being projected, right? And that's just it's a bit, I think that could be a bit exhausting for the audience, right? Because they're going back and forth and it might pull them out. I'm not sure you'd want to see every opera like that. It was a great experiment, really fun, but it's really sort of help people also understand, I think, and get used to what is possible as we bring this to the bigger stages and the bigger pieces. So I thought that was really quite cool.
Yeah, and what was kind of also interesting in that production was you see those green men who's trying to kind of flapping the capes of the gods in Valhalla, and then just literally see them flapping the capes, which creates that magic on the top level, you know, of the so there were a lot of audiences who were laughing at those sort of moments where the green men just coming and go and doing those kind of strange things on stage. So
because they're invisible, right? I mean, that's what's so cool about it, right? Stuff like that.
That's cool. Yeah.
All right, excellent. I want to jump in and just open the floor to our participants in case anybody has any questions. And I just want to kind of give you guys two observations that sort of coming from the conversation that I noticed. The first one is that it seems that the most successful pieces are the ones who sort of combine the content and the form. So, like, you know, the form comments on the content and vice versa. Yeah, there is sort of acknowledgement that we are dealing with a new form rather than trying to recreate pre-existing works or recreate pre-existing models of doing things onto a new technologies. I try to acknowledge that this is a new technology and that this has a completely different way of doing things, and so the content of it is going to be commenting on that. And I really like that, particularly in Kamala's work. That happens a lot, yeah, with the little piece which we saw at the beginning with the here's looking at you. It's very much also there because the technology is kind of the surveillance technology which audience members experience in the moment is part of the content of the theme of the show as well. It seems to be those works which engage and play with that relationship between form and content seem to be the most successful. And the second observation that I sort of that sort of came to me when I was listening to what you guys talk about was there might be a kind of a new field opening in cognition and technologies and opera arts and cognition. Yeah, like I'm kind of thinking this on the spot right now, brainstorming with you. But I'm wondering if there is an opening for musicians and artists and technologists working with cognitive, neuroscientists in some way, trying to figure out how those things actually affect us, whether in a positive or negative way, whether they can have some kind of medical application even, yeah? And for the artists, you know, and for a broader industry, you know, music industry or performing arts industry, really to try to really understand what kind of neurological impact those technologies make. I mean, we already had some of that, you know, with film, yeah, a lot of, you know, as psychologists and neuroscientists, kind of trying to figure out, you know, that in the 60s and the 70s, how film, how people respond to film, like what does film, you know, what does film do to your psyche? And I feel like maybe there will be another kind of branch of research going into this direction, because it seems that it's a whole sort of new area that we have not yet fully explored. And Ellen speaks so wonderfully and so, you know, just so much insight on that, that made me think, well, maybe there is a whole area that remains to be discovered. All right, so this is my 2 pennies. Ramona, do you want to jump in and do you want to give questions, or do you want to comment on the panel?
I think, why don't we, I think I love your questions. We should have the responses first then, otherwise there's so much already on the table, and then I'll jump in after that.
Well, this was not, I mean, this was not a really question. This was just a mere, you know, trying to summarize your points. But if anybody has a response to it, I would love to hear what you guys have to say.
I guess I would say, you know, there is a branch of psychomusicology that is looking at a lot of these things, like Jamshed Barucha, I know, has some neural net models of how people experience pitch. But I think there's a lot of opportunity in that a lot of these studies don't actually use music. So, or at least when I have a former life as a psycholinguist, so that's actually what my doctorate is in. And when I was working on my doctorate, there were not studies about this, but this was a while ago. So there's probably more out there. But I do think that you know, one of the things that we always talked about in my lab was the fact that a lot of these studies use single pitches or sine waves rather than using music as the materials that are being analyzed for the brain. And that's not really the same. So I think there is a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you, Kamala, because that I never knew. Who knew, right? That's interesting. I do work with human-computer interaction scientists, and I get into raging debates with them, actually. And I'm because you see, when they do these studies, and they do the studies, what they have is one question, and they use the creative practice in the service of that question. And I have tremendous arguments with them, because I say that the creative practice is not the servant of the scientists. And we've really gone at it sometimes. And so, yes, there are medical applications. That's primarily how the arts are integrated into the scientific community, is through medical and therapeutic studies. And I take issue with that. Strong issue with it. And there's a lot of flashpoints on it, but there's also a lot of breakthroughs in the ability to help people who suffered traumatic brain damage, vision loss, motion loss. I mean, there's been tremendous breakthroughs on the other hand. So it has a dual edge to it, of breakthroughs and also subservience of the arts to the scientific breakthroughs. So it's a very strange tension that exists between the two communities.
I actually just wanted to jump in and off of what you were saying, Ellen, and also in general, given the immense sort of interdisciplinarity and innovation that's in your work, in all of your works, about this question of communication, because I've found that often, you know, as you were sort of working with computer scientists and VR specialists and that often also that communication and really kind of finding a way of collaborating together and speaking the same language and wanting the same things in rehearsal can be really quite complicated to get to. So I was wondering how you sort of address that and how that process works for all of you.
I think the interesting thing about working with people from a different discipline is learning their language, and that every discipline has its jargon, and often you'll be using the same words and you won't necessarily mean the same thing. And so learning jargon and learning also just norms of collaboration is really important. For example, when we were working on Looking at You, we were working with coders from Bandcamp.com and privacy researchers from Carnegie Mellon, and a lot of them, you know, they're coders, so they're used to going off and working on their own and not talking to people while they're working on their project. And what ended up happening is one of the coders went and made a change to our database the week before the show opened and broke it because he didn't talk to anybody else about what they were doing. And so then, you know, we all had to have a conversation about how in this kind of a situation, we have to be communicative in a way that they don't always have to be, and when they're working on their projects on their own. So, you know, that was just a lesson in how the ways that people work are really specific to the discipline and they're in. So having that conversation before they break your database is probably a good idea.
Communication.
Like, don't let your coder break the show day before. After tech. Like, nobody touches anything after tech.
That's
I don't care how much tempted you are, yeah?
Yeah, that's a real thing though, right? We don't get to change anything once we've done the dress rehearsal. We have to just walk away.
You just deal with it. Sorry, I know there is a bug, but it's working.
Yeah. Yeah. Those changes.
Right. Do we have any questions in the audience? Anybody wanna jump in? Our audience members, our attendees? Anybody, if you have a question, you can type it or you can let us know and we will let you speak. Anybody want to jump in? People are just not to talk about it today, but we can continue our conversation. That's okay too. Even if you have any questions, please feel free to contribute. Jingyi, do you have any other thought that you wanted to bring forward?
Yeah, sure. So I have also prepared some kind of speaker-specific questions at the end. So this is like depending on how much time we have. So I think we have the time for this. So maybe while we were waiting for the audience questions coming in, I can start asking those questions. So maybe we can start off same thing in alphabetical order. So starting with Jelena, because Jelena is also part of my edited book project. So I'm really fortunate that she could write about her latest research on landscape dramaturgy in opera, which kind of departs from this kind of logocentric thought and moving into kind of eccentric epistemologies and performance events. So could you share with us more on this new concept and how this new dramaturgical sensibility illuminates these contemporary operas that you are currently studying? You are muted.
Sorry. Thank you for the question. The concept of landscape dramaturgy, I read about it from the theorist Anna Vujanovic. It's not a basically new thing, but this theory takes it and reworks it in a way and reinvents the concept. So basically landscape dramaturgy, she says what it has to do with dramaturgy and with landscape. And if it's in a classical sense that landscape deals with the nature and dramaturgy deals with the drama, then she says it has to do nothing with landscape and dramaturgy. Basically, what she does is she discusses the perspective. The perspective is a way of seeing things and way of understanding things that is so deeply rooted in our culture that we even don't, we are not even conscious of it when we see some performances that are even developed with the concepts that, for example, does not have perspective or organization on stage, but the way how we perceive things still deals with this classical perspective. So she discusses the notion of perspective. She discusses the notion of the landscape, mentioning the concept of straying also, concept of straying, like making the road that is not the straight road, but kind of wandering around. And then the concept of dramaturgy, more in a sense like Hans Thies Lehmann defined post-dramatic theater, like when the verbal text is not the one that is in the hierarchy of the theatrical texts, the most important one, but all the other texts like the scenography, the costumes, the light, verbal text also have kind of equal or in a way disturbed role when compared with the classical way how it was done. So in that sense, what concept of landscape dramaturgy proposes often is multiplying the points of view, like not one point of view like in classical perspective, but multiplying them. And then, for example, this you can encounter. It's quite a few recent operas. One that comes to mind is again Michel van der Ra's Upload, the piece that deals with. I think you had a chance also to see it in New York, probably. So the father and a daughter, the father decides to be uploaded, and then he stays only as a file in the computer. And then the way how the performance develops through various screens on stage that communicate one with another, forming different entities. That is precisely, I think, this multiplying of points of view that is mentioned in landscape dramaturgy concepts. That is like one example.
Cool. So let's move on to my next question is for Alan. So I think you answered part of this question already in our very interdisciplinary, and messy conversations just now. But maybe I'm really kind of fascinated by your new project, I think, which you haven't really talked much about just now, because it's really kind of working at the cutting edge of technologies, right? It's based on speech to visual AI and its relation to epigenetic, which might be a very unfamiliar term to a lot of us here today. So could you speak more about this amazing work and the technologies that's involved and how it's materialized on stage?
Sure, and I just want to add one thing. I did see Upload, and I want to congratulate people from the Netherlands on the financial support they gave Michael van der to do such a fantastic production. I just thought I'd put that plug in. Yeah, what's happened in the past year is new artificial intelligence technologies have arisen, which are creating text or speech to text to visuals. Mm-hmm. And right now they take a minute or so to create, but they're going to get faster. And also they're going to turn into movies. So as you begin to let's say, map out a dialogue and talk about it, you could get a whole scenario set up just by speaking it. And that's being referred to as prompt engineering. In other words, your speech is the prompt and you're going to engineer the visual by what you say in speech. For a year already, I've been working on this, and the technology is so experimental that unless you have a server farm behind you, in order to produce 5 seconds of a video, it takes 2 hours to render it. And that's that's how rough it is to begin to make this. But how it relates to epigenetics, and I'll explain what epigenetics is very easily. Epigenetics is inherited trauma that affects your rDNA that's passed through cultures of diaspora in ways that are not necessarily verbal and not necessarily digitized or able to be tagged. And as we enter the digital world, these things are going to be forgotten, lost, and fall through the cracks. So I'm beginning to explore my own epigenetic experiences because I am from a culture of diaspora. And that's, I'm calling in from Poland, where I'll be working on a project over the next year about my own culture of diaspora that is from this area called the Pale of Lithuania. That's the diasporic term. And so I want to see how, as I tell or create the story, these AI technologies, and especially multilingual AI technologies, render the visuals. So what I've had to do here is find a bunch of mathematicians who are going to write me algorithms to speed up the rendering and facilitate the rendering so I can make the piece, because I'm not Meta or Apple, and I don't have render farms behind me. So I know it sounds rather abstract, but I do have proof of concepts of this. And that what that means is Michael van der Aar referred to it a little itsy bit when he was talking in Upload about the memories of the person being uploaded. And AI is going to create our cultural memory as we move forward. It's going to be a shared cultural memory, and anything that can't be digitized won't be remembered. So he alluded to it sort of on the side in Upload. I was very taken by Upload. I thought it was brilliant. And so mine won't be as brilliant as his, but because the technologies I'm working with are just so spanking new that they're not as polished. So I don't know if that makes any sense. And, I can't show it yet because I only have 5 seconds of a proof of concept. That's not enough. But in a year or two, I fully intend to use it and show it.
Is it mapping out it's fascinating. Is it mapping out the emotional trauma through the brain processes, or is it through the language? I just didn't get that.
Okay, so what it is let's say, here's a real example. So let's say I say the sun is shining to you. All of a sudden an image will come up of the sun is shining, right? But it doesn't reflect my perception of the sun shining when I say it. It reflects AI's perception of what that is. So as I begin to talk about my epigenetic memories, I will use multi-language versions of AI creating movies of this. And then probably, and I know this is going to really kill the opera people, but I really want to make the sonic environment driven by AI and biometrics. I know, but the sonic environment will be based on actual compositions, but the whole thing will be AI composed. And that is threatening to a lot of people in music, but actually it's only another tool. It's not going to take away composing music or anything. It's just how the music is rendered and how it can be interpreted will be, I think the word is reified or rehashed in an interesting way. So that's where I'm going, not because this does it better than anyone else, but because society will be entering a phase in the next 20 years. We're in the beginning of it now, where just as we're in the age of the internet and Zoom, and we were in the age of radio and telephone, we're now really at that exact same point with the age of AI. This is the beginning of the age of AI. So that's why I'm doing it, using creative practices as the tool to enter it, because creative practices must enter it. They must, because that's their job. So that's all I want to say. And I know it sounds abstract, so give me about 2 years.
I know a lot of designers who are starting to use art generators to help them create AI art generators to help them create content.
Right.
And it is scary what the art generators come up with and the amount of time it saves for certain designers.
Right. So the next question is for Kamala, and I think you addressed most of it in the at the start of our conversation today. But if you want to elaborate, expand more on this, so the question is, and I'm hoping to share with us the process of composing. All decisions will be made by consensus, which is the video, the brief excerpt you showed us in the beginning today. And how this new medium impacts the compositional process. Did you write differently? What are some kind of new styles of composing that have emerged from the pandemic?
Well, I mean, the main thing is, again, I think this is sort of the thing that we've been talking about this whole time, is that the form has to match the content. So for all decisions, one of the things that we experimented with early on was to see how far apart the latency was and what to do about that. And so the way to deal with it is to make it part of the composition and not to fight against it. And so I can actually show you the score, which I've never cleaned this score up, so it's not the most beautiful score ever. But what you'll see is the way that it works is just there are these aleatoric boxes, right? And then I am actually playing the electronics live also, so what happens is the singer has a pitch set, but it's done in modern chant notation. So the rhythm is entirely up to them because there's no pulse to sync up with. And then when they get to this point, then we get a cue and they go on to the next section. And this is pretty much how it works through the whole piece. Let me find a part where everybody's, so here, these are two parts where the singers are in their own time here, and they just repeat this box until we get to the next cue. So in this way, we sort of push and pull each other through the whole piece. And this is something I actually am an improviser also, and have done quite a bit of work with Anthony Braxton as a performer rather. And so, I come from an improvisation background, and that's not something that you get to do much in opera. So this was interesting for me to figure out how to use graphic notation and aleatory to give this more open feel to something. And I used this style of notation in a piece I just did for Washington National Opera. Obviously, you can't have the whole orchestra having cues like this. So the cues were just in piano. Let me see if I can find the score real quick so I can show it to you. And let me find so it works the same way, in that the singers have this open section, and then when they get to a cue point, everyone kind of moves on together. Sorry, if I can't find it quickly, then I will. Well, here, I'll just show you this. This is not as intense an example as what we were just looking at, but you can see here in the middle of the orchestra score, our singer has this sort of free chant notation, and everyone else has a fermata, and then when she's done, we move on to the next bar. So this is this thing that I started to do in the pandemic, trying to make its way into these bigger, more conventional pieces.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool how this new medium kind of forces the improvisation, right, to occupy a much important role here, and that is I think is really a huge innovation, considering opera as a hugely we have like notated format. Everything has to be closely aligned to the score. So I thought that was really a very fresh take.
Though it's actually also kind of an old take, right? Taking us all the way back to like early Baroque music when you don't have the same sense of pulse. So it's interesting. We've kind of come full circle, I guess.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay. So my final question is for Brian. So you've talked a little bit about the Everest, the graphic novel opera you've directed. So I was hoping that you could talk in more detail about how is everything gets put together, like what is pre-recorded, what's live, and then some unexpected challenges while putting together this production.
So it's a real specific process. We had to record it, make a recording of it, get the excerpts while we're still sort of doing a final mix of what actual takes we're going to use, because then we would go into the studio with the singers. And for motion capture, it would be getting specific dot patterns on their face. Then you're able to sort of cue that out, take that extracted, cued out face, have the illustrator we have great Mark Simmons, brilliant illustrator, would give, look just like the character. Like I didn't show Sasha Cook, but you're like, oh my God, it's Sasha Cook as a cartoon. And then that is layered on. And what's really interesting, which is different than a cartoon where you're making all these different frames, the motion capture starts to control the image and therefore gives it real emotion. You can, when they're crying or they're upset, it's this emotion versus sort of a drawn version of it. It actually is a true mixture. And that's why it feels like AI actually on some level. No, it's not, but it feels like we're now merging these two types of elements. Then we do layering of that, right? We'd layer that by having the backdrop, animating that, popping everything in. The filmmaker, David Murakami. And then syncing it all together, having big page turns and all of these different layers, using panning in, pulling out. So it really felt like we wanted it to feel like you're like opening a book as a film and then pushing in to the different panels and then coming to life, and then sometimes then being frozen. You're looking at it like it's a normal picture, and then all of a sudden it comes to life, right? These kind of dramaturgic elements that are really fun to tell the story. And then I did want to, let me show one quick thing and then I'll pass the baton. We're going to take those assets. I just wanted to show you this one picture because it's sort of fun. And this is sort of what the experience is going to be when you go into the immersive environment. So there will be these physical rock elements, which will have a playing area and then the whole area. And then people will be wearing white ponchos and they'll have surround sound. So if a singer is singing to you from a rock or the side, there'll be speakers supporting that. So that's sort of what's also interesting is how you can take assets now and use them in different places, right? I mean, it's a totally different thing than a film. And that's a really, it's nice for just, not just efficiency, but also just gives an opportunity for people to see it in different ways.
Yeah, this is super cool. I personally really loved it when I first watched it. So I hope more people can get the opportunity to appreciate that opera. Cool. So I'm really
Thank you.
grateful for everyone on this panel today and such rich discussions. Magda, do you have anything to add? I think we have a question. Oh,
We
yeah,
have a question. The audience members get excited. Oh yeah, there is a poll asks, are there any residency programs, research labs that are emerging as incubators for the types of speculative abstract innovations that Ellen spoke to for future of opera? Conversely, are there incubators that are not explicitly within the context of opera, but are nonetheless influencing the field? Yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of new things out there. Yeah, the regular theaters are making calls for experimental opera pieces, and more so right now than it used to be before the pandemic. I mean, yeah.
There have been a couple of companies that are specifically allocating money for new digital projects. And then San Diego Opera, for example, has the opera hack that happens every summer, where it's sort of like a hackathon, but dealing with opera. And I know that Renaissance Opera in Vancouver also did an opera hack last year. So I think that there's more interest in it, but I don't think that it's something that is formally institutional quite yet, though it's heading in that direction.
We did an opera hack, Kamala, for Lighthouse, and the people who won figured out a way to put a fishy smell, because it was supposed to be in the ocean, and blow fishy smell through the through the audience, you know. So like, you know, you come in and the ocean is here, and it was hilarious. But opera hack, you know, are really actually can be really interesting, because again, you bring in all these different people who are trying to help you. I had a question for Kamala, actually, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
I was just curious if you're finding that people are more open as a composer to working with you in the conception of the overall piece, because I noticed you do that kind of work, or they just know if they're going to work with you, that's part of the recipe, or do you feel like that's like sort of more common throughout the industry?
No. I
didn't
find
think
that
so.
no, usually what happens is I get a nutty idea, and then I just talk to a bunch of people until I find other nutty people who want to do it. And most of the time that happens outside of the context of an opera company. And then sometimes they'll jump on later on in the process, but they're not usually there at the beginning. One exception to that was Tri-Cities Opera, who came to me to ask if I wanted to do this virtual reality version of an older piece, because I had this experience doing VR already. But they're a small company, they're a smaller company. And so I think that has something to do with it.
So your advice to young composers is get a team together and make it good, and people will follow.
Yes, that is ideally what happens. Otherwise, make it yourself. Don't wait for them.
Yeah, I think that's what I tell people all the time. You got to make it yourself. Yeah, don't wait.
All right.
Yeah. We also have another question, I think, from Jonathan.
We have another question. Rama, do you want to read it?
Yeah. So Jonathan is asking, as leading practitioners in your fields, do you sense a change in dramatic storytelling principles as new methods of media are introduced over the decades? Anybody want to start on that? Digital dramaturgies.
Did the storytelling itself change? I mean, is it been affected by those technological changes?
Yeah, I want to jump in with something that's going to address that in a really interesting way. When I first made the brain opera, I didn't have a story with it that I told the audience, and I ran it by test audiences. I just had the events happening and something going on, and the audiences in the proof of concept test thing said and asked, please give us a story. And I was, because this was a school of digital media, this wasn't a music conservatory. And I was stunned by that. And so I find the answer to that is that the audience and the human condition wants a story. that the audience who were literate but not professionals just said, please give us a story. They actually came out and asked for it. So I don't think human storytelling and narrative is going to go away. I think what happens is the presentation and form is going to change. But I think we're hardwired as humans to want it. And when I took it away, I was politely but insistently asked by all the test audiences to please put it back. So that's the roundabout way of answering that.
And that begs the question of content and form again, too, right? You know, how do you have, if your content is abstract and aleatoric, it's hard to have form.
There's another question.
Yeah, there's another question from Zach about audiences. So what has been your impression on the reception to experimental operas from longtime opera fans and regular audiences? How significant is experimental opera as a cultural force in the opera community? So do you have new audiences, or do you actually take the regulars with you as well?
I can answer that. I think there are even two worlds of opera, like you have the world of classical ballet and contemporary dance that basically don't have the same institutions and basically are not the same art. In a way, we can look to the world of opera in that way also. There is conventional opera with its institutions, and there is this new opera or experimental opera or post-opera that is still forming its world and its institutions. And basically, I think in most of the cases, the audience is not the same even. So that would be the answer.
And I would add that it's important that they're not the same. Like, I think one of the mistakes that opera companies often make is trying to use contemporary opera as a carrot to lure people to see the older opera. And that's not the way that it always works. And it's not the way that it should work, because ideally we want more people to be watching opera as a whole, or to experience as an art form as a whole. And this just, it makes the pool of people bigger, which I think in the end is good for everybody.
And Brian, your work can, when I look at it, is work that's designed to bring a new audience, a new generation to opera. I mean, it's ready, set to go to bring a mediated generation who's very screen based into opera. It's wonderful. It's really the way to go for certain. I'm not saying other people can't enjoy it, but I think you've discovered the medium and the presentation form, which is valid for adults, but will bring a new generation in. I really do think that.
Thank you. I think that, to Kamala's point, though, that there's a tiny bit of crossover. Like if you go to the big house, you'll see some of those people at your contemporary opera company production. But then it's interesting also the kind of additive group from people who like experimental theater, people who like experimental dance, people like just going into different kinds of surround sound immersive experiences. All those people like that, they kind of the experimental art form sort of, they cross over. I don't know if you find that, Kamala, but that's what it's a different audience for sure.
All right. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up, but that was a fascinating conversation and just such a wonderful, insight from all of you, and great energy and synergy between the speakers, and just truly one of the best panels I've ever participated in. So I'm thrilled that I had the opportunity to be here with you, and we want to give special thanks to Jingyi and for chairing the panel. And thank you so much. You did an excellent job. Did her screen froze at the end? After all, we were worrying this was going to happen, and she
made it through. Woo!
The screen held up until the very end. And we're going to also, express our special thanks to Mahindra Humanities Center and MetaLab for hosting us. And I invite all of the panelists and participants to view our other seminars this academic year, which includes different types of talks and conversations as well. So I welcome you all to check it out. I thank you again, and we will be posting this panel online hopefully soon. And I hope to see everybody back at different panel.
Okay, thanks.
Pleasure.